Hey, welcome back to another Touchdesigner tutorial. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and we're going to be taking a look at Touchdesigner for creatives who are looking to learn the software or just to get started. So basically, this is going to be very informal, a bit more of just a discussion. I had someone reach out to me on Instagram telling me how overwhelming the interface is for Touchdesigner and how they want to make interactive visuals but have no idea where to start and don't really see the resources online. And I was like, that sucks. I know how to do that. I wonder if I can pass that information on. So if this video does well for my very amateur, fresh standards, then I'll continue the series and I'll sort of build towards making interactive visuals. So we'll look at making very basic visuals like the one you see on screen right now, or posters, and then we'll look to integrate it with reactivity to cameras or touch or audio or just a whole bunch of different data, because that's kind of where Touchdesigner excels. So today we're going to talk a little bit about me, Touchdesigner, and who this tutorial's for. Then we're going to also do a little bit about the interface and navigating the software, talking about nodes, connecting them together, the palette, and then recording and projecting what you make. And hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you should at least be able to navigate the software and feel confident enough to take on maybe another tutorial that someone has laid out, or potentially one of mine, I suppose. What you're seeing on screen, by the way, is going to just be the example that we use for today. This is a leftover file I made from a tutorial I made that never released, where I made a tutorial for Touchdesigner aimed at graphic designers. Now, if that's something you're interested in, then I'd be very keen to re-explore this, as I feel like you can make some really, really cool graphic design elements, or at least integrate that into your designs. But enough talk. A little bit about me. So my name's Nick. I have been using Touchdesigner for well over a year now, and prior to doing what I do now, I was a software engineer, and that was not really cutting it out for me personally. And so I switched to this more creative path that I'm on now, where my main activity is actually doing visuals at clubs, where I take in the audio and do live generative pieces. I also do pieces with movement, installations, and just general art, I suppose. A lot of that is on my Instagram, if that doesn't intrigue you. But the point of me making this channel was that I saw a lot of big Touchdesigner creators are moving away from the space, and it's also becoming a more and more unapproachable space overall, where there's really, really, really great, talented channels out there releasing very custom toolkits, specialized tools. And as I'm watching those tutorials, it's extremely helpful, but I've had a lot of people just constantly voice to me like they really want to try Touchdesigner, but it is just not approachable, or is very difficult for people to approach. And I've heard a lot of feedback on how they could make the software more approachable, but one little way is at least doing tutorials like this. So the way I learned Touchdesigner is, one, I have a programming background. So a lot of concepts in what Touchdesigner is based around programming. That's because it's what we call a node-based programming software. So these little things, these little boxes are nodes or operators, and they all do a little function, and then we sort of program them all together to do something cool. Now, you don't actually need to type out any physical code, don't stress. You can actually do that if you want. There is a lot of great support for it in the software. But essentially, I just learnt the software through knowing basic coding techniques and following a bunch of tutorials online. Now, the community is maybe moving away from being less beginner friendly, but that said, there is still a wealth of amazing tutorials out there, and also just hopefully this tutorial can serve as just a starting off point for you to jump in the software, start playing around, just like drag little nodes and do crazy little stuff like that. But yeah, this again, last little point, this tutorial is for people that have not used Touchdesigner or have used it very little before. We're going to build towards making interactive visuals, but probably not in this video. Today we'll just simply focus on the interface and all the other simple things. Now, I think that's enough. Apologies, I have no script or anything like that, kind of just making it up as I go along. But what I'm going to do is clear this project file. Before I do, I should mention the visual that you're seeing in the background, so just the part without the text. If I get rid of the text, oh no, that didn't do it. If I get rid of the text like that, I made a tutorial for this. It's already on my YouTube channel. As you can see, it's tiny, it's super easy. Could definitely be worth a try afterwards. Otherwise, I do release all of my project files from my tutorials, but also just other art pieces I do on my Patreon. It's less than $10 a month and you get full access to everything I release. Currently doing like 2 to 3 a week. That will probably die down soon, but if you want just a wealth of constant new techniques and Touchdesigner coming through your way, whether it's interactive or just audio reactive or just like cool looking stuff, then please go and head over there and you'll be able to download anything I post. Cool. All right, let's delete this and let's dive straight in. Hopefully that wasn't too long of a yap. So when you open up Touchdesigner, you'll probably see the default project, which has a bunch of little jelly beans. Feel free to either keep that or delete it. But for today's sake, we're just going to go around with a blank file and build it from there. So in Touchdesigner, we have our main window here, which is just this little grid that we can zoom out, and I zoomed out a bit too far there. Zoom in and just navigate with your mouse like so. Down the bottom, we have our time-based toolbar, really. You can press space to, play and pause. You can manually set your FPS here as well as the length. So on default, Touchdesigner will just loop back and forth. I believe it's a 10-second loop on default. And that's not necessarily relevant to a lot of people, but if you're doing keyframing like animation, or if you want to record certain lengths of videos or whatever it may be, that may be a useful thing for you to explore. You can also set like the range to just go through once and then it will stop, otherwise loops. You can change it to the beats, as there's support for music integration in Touchdesigner, so this is super useful, but we're just going to keep it on timecode today. This little palette here isn't super relevant right now, but we'll come back to that. Then we have up the top, so this will differ based on your operating software, but obviously we have all the typical file, edit, help. Shout out the Touchdesigner wiki. It looks exactly like Wikipedia. It's a really detailed wiki, and I highly recommend looking through there if you ever have questions about how operators work. The forum's also super active and responsive, and there's some really great tutorials out there as well. So highly recommend all of that. This T3D you won't have there. That's a custom toolkit, which is built by another member of the community who's really talented. Next we have a perform mode. So when we click this, it'll show us our perform window. We have our palette, so you can actually click this, and we'll talk about this later, but the palette is also a really super useful thing, especially for beginners. We have different layout options. You can create split windows. Like a lot of people would like to have their visuals displayed in a separate window, split down the side. Personally, I just like having it on the back. For me, it helps keep it all singular and focused, and it's just a very much a preference thing. And then we have our very typical like navigation buttons up here. So that's kind of just how what you need to know about Touchdesigner is it's this massive window where mostly everything takes place, and then you have your typical controls above and below. Nothing really out of the ordinary there. So next I want to talk about nodes. So when we press tab, or if you right click and go add operator, you will get this window. Now, this is probably the first overwhelming part of Touchdesigner, but don't stress. I'm just going ahead and and get a noise operator. So you can start typing letters into here and it will start filtering it out like so. And then you just click and then click again to drop it. So I'm quite zoomed out, so let's zoom back in here. So this is what we call a node or an operator. Generally they're called nodes, but Touchdesigner has their own name for them, operators. And every single little box, so operator, does its own thing. So it can take in information, for example, or it can be a source of information, and then it tweaks it in a particular way. So this one we have here, which I don't want to get hung up on the specifics of operators today, but specific operators I should say, but this one's called noise. And you can see that when we're clicked on it, we have the controls up here in the top right. You can also make this hover, but I like keeping it up here on the top right. Each operator has unique controls. So if I go ahead and just get a different one, so if I just get, let's do an edge, you can see an edge's controls are completely different to a noise. Now there's generally some shared ones. I'm just gonna bypass this at the moment, so disable it. Such as under the common tab, you typically have your output resolutions, your different pixel formats and all of that. But other than that, it's pretty different. And when we drag these sliders around, you can see it actually changes the operator. Now, noise is probably not the most beginner friendly one, but that being said, it is also probably one of the most useful components of Touchdesigner, especially if you're creating generative visuals. Noise will be something you constantly are using. So we're not going to go super in depth to what each of these do. It's just important to know that each operator does its own little thing. So when we press tab again, you can see that we have all of our purple ones here. So there's a whole bunch of them. I've been using Touchdesigner for over a year and I still don't think I could tell you what every single one of them does down to a T. Like, it's not super important to know what they all are and what they do. You'll slowly learn this over time and you'll start to also gravitate towards certain effects just based on your own taste. But another thing to note is that we have this little bar across the top. Now again, you won't have T3D, don't worry about that. But we have our tops, chops, sops, mat, dat, and then comp as well. So these are all different groupings of operators. Now I'm going to do a lot of generalization here. Again, this is meant to be a non-technical tutorial. So all of our tops here, so our purple operators, are typically video or video effects, just like how we had noise. So noise in this case is being represented as a still image, but like a image or a video. If I go to our chop tab here, we have a whole bunch of new ones. So we have, typically chop is for, I like to group it as information. This could be like data that we pass in, or it could be an LFO. It's not exactly for data you pass in yourself, but like generating data or analyzing data. So if I get a noise that is a chop, which also has a noise, you can see the difference here. So these are both noise operators, but the purple one is more for video and the green one is defined more as a like numeric output in this case. And you can see that when we play with the effects, they have some of the same parameters between them, but not all the same. yeah, let's go back into here. So we have, video and then data, let's say. Touchdesigner, for me, one of the biggest appeals is the ability to combine all these different technical mediums and data analysis and whatever, and perform it all in real time. I've had a lot of people express interest being like, hey, you could use Unreal to do these sort of things, and it's like, it's totally possible to do a lot of what you can do in other softwares. And in fact, a software such as Unreal would be a lot better at 3D environments, but Touchdesigner sort of acts as like a one shoe fits all kind of software. So if you're someone that is a graphic designer or someone interested in making digital art, potentially doing live visuals of sorts, Touchdesigner could serve as a really good medium to intersect what you make or want to make with other mediums. For example, you make stuff in Blender, you want to make it react to music in real time and manipulate that. Touchdesigner is perfect. You want to also bring in video effects and post-processing. Touchdesigner does it all in one go. So that brings us to our next little section here, our SOPs. Now, SOPs is generally for 3D objects. So if I go ahead and get a sphere, where is my sphere? There we are. You can see we have a 3D sphere. Just changed all my pronunciations like so. And I'm just going to quickly go through the other categories. So, it is good to note that we can do a lot of real 3D or real-time 3D object manipulation and etc. in Touchdesigner. We have our materials tab, so you can make a material, you can import a material like so and then apply it to 3D objects. Not exactly just like dragging and dropping it like that, but that's quite possible. We have our data tab, which again, if you want to have, say, a file feeding straight in or a web server feeding information in, you can do such here. I very rarely use data. It's definitely one of the more specialized ones, but if you're doing something quite technical, it is a really useful grouping. And then we also have our comp tab here. Our comp is kind of a bunch of different tools. Typically we'll use it when we're rendering stuff. So cameras, and there's lighting, geometries as well. But it's not just limited to that. You can see it's broken down into these little subcategories along the top here. But yeah, that's pretty much the different groups of operators and how they all exist independent from one another. So I next want to look at a few more controls on these boxes, so on the operators themselves, and then we're going to talk about actually connecting them all together. So let's just zoom in to our noise operator and separate it up here. So we have a bunch of little buttons going on. So yes, when we click it, we have all of our controls here, as well as a few different tabs depending on what it is that you're changing. But we also have a few other things. So firstly, we have these holes on either side. It differs for some. For example, this one doesn't have any inputs, but it does have one output. Whereas the noise operator here has two inputs and one output. And when you hover over them, it will sort of tell you what it does. So that first input is going to be used as a background image for the noise. And the second one will be used as a noise coordinate map. And then when we output it, this one should just say output, I believe, or nothing, but it simply just outputs how we transform the data from here. Forgive me, sorry. Just had lunch. So those are what the little holes are, and we're going to learn how to connect those later. Next, let's go down the side here. So we have our viewer. When we toggle this, it hides it and shows it off. One thing to note is that when we have all of our viewers switched on, like it's on right now, it's going to be more computationally intensive because it's trying to run all the individual processing things and display that while also calculating what they do and rendering the final output. So in a large project, it's good just to have them all turned off like that, and then when you want to go and work on one of them, I tend to turn it on. Next we have our clone immune, which just immunes the clone. I very rarely use that one, so I'm just going to skip over it for now. Next we have our bypass, which I just used before to essentially just disable. But also say we have a node coming in and then one going out. If we click bypass, it's just going to bypass this operator altogether. So skip it essentially, or disable it, whatever way helps you think about it. And then finally we have our lock, which just freezes all of the current transformations that are happening in place. By this I mean, I'm going to type in a little piece of code. Don't worry about this one. And then I'm going to have to make that faster so it's a little bit more obvious what's happening. And then I'm also going to go to this common tab here and make the resolution much bigger. And that's also still really not obvious what's happening. Maybe if I make the period slow, maybe I'm gonna do this instead. Oh, so fun little realization. I have the project paused. I, funnily enough, make that mistake way too often. Okay, so going back to what I was saying, you can see we have an animation going on here. And when we click the lock button, it just freezes that animation as is, and anything going in and out will be on this frozen operator. Next, we have our little blue button on the top bottom right, which displays it. On default, your display will be set to your background. And so when we zoom out, you can see it's been set as our background. I really like to keep it that way, but again, you can create new panels or panes up here, and then set your panels to be just viewers or whatever you want. This is my preferred way. And then the final button we have is this viewer active, which in broad terms just lets us interact with it. So for this video operator, we can't actually really interact with it too much, aside from displaying some different points like that. But if I go down to our sphere, which is a 3D object, when I click viewer active, I can actually drag around. If this was a light, you could move a light this way. It really depends on what it is, what type of operator it is. Here we can see we can navigate around it. And then here, it's a 3D sort of navigation as well. But this essentially just allows us to interact with it as general purpose. You'll see that depending on which operator it is, there's a few other outputs. A lot of these aren't super important earlier on. Just know that they all have their own individual functions that you can hover over and see what they do. But again, we're not going to cover those in this tutorial. Cool, so I hope that is making sense so far. So just a reminder, we have all these little boxes. They all do their own individual effects and changes, and we're going to show you how to connect them up now. So earlier we had this edge tool, which we disabled because it was complaining at me. It was complaining because it has no input defined. So what I'm going to do is I want to connect this noise to an edge. So I go from the output of the noise and I click and drag a line and it connects like that. Now you can see the edge is pretty happy. It's also doing a little something for us. So if I go ahead and make this our background, you can see, I'm just going to freeze the animation here. You can see just vaguely what's going on. And if you know what an edge is, it's essentially just highlighting the edges that it detects in this input here. So if I turn the strength up, it's going to get a lot more obvious. And then if we turn the black level down, it's going to, the black level up, create more of a difference between the on and off. So there's a few other parameters we can play with here, like comping it over the input, which basically just means compositing it over whatever we're inputting. And we can leave that off. But you can see that if I put these side by side, it's actually this input, so this is probably around the wrong way. Oh well. The input on the left here, when I zoom in, is actually directly being translated into the output on the right and then being affected. And it's the same. If we go before the noise and we go ahead and get a movie file in, which will give us a little banana, that first input we had was background image. So when we drag and drop it into there, you can see that's been set as the background, which then passes into the noise, which keeps going down the chain onto the edge. And you can see that now all the way at the very end, we have a banana. So it sort of just goes from 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, typically left to right, and it just flows on effects like so. So when we change something in the middle section, it'll change everything else after it, but not everything before it. So it's sort of a one-way flow. Now, there are concepts where we can do loops and send information backwards and have it sort of create a little loop like that. We're not going to get into anything too complex like that today. It's not too complex, but we're just not going to get into that today. But just know, when I'm saying a rule, it's like in school. It's like, yeah, there's these rules, but it's only really rules because we can't tell you the full truth just yet. So typically, yes, left to right flows one direction is typically how this works. Now, let's say we want to connect this edge to our chop, so our green noise here. You'll see that when we drag a line to one another, this little hole closes up and it's like, no, you can't do that. And that's because we can't exactly translate one parameter into another. However, there are other ways around that. There's a few different ways. So one of which is when we right click the output here, this is going to auto connect a node for us. So when we right click, for example, and then go to a null, so null's just going to be a basic thing, and we drop it, it's already automatically going to be connected for us. Then when we right click and go to the different tabs, it's showing us, oh hey, if you want to turn this video into a 3D object, this is the tool for it. Or same for a material or chop. So let's do a SOP actually. So we get this thing called a trace. And what a trace does is, it's actually really hard to see because we have a really bad threshold here. I'm gonna disable the noise so we get a really solid image. So we've just disabled the noise right now, so we simply have the banana flowing through by using the bypass. You can see that we now have this little trace. This trace basically traces the input image to a 3D object using lines. And if I go and interact with it, you can see we have a little flat 2D banana in this space. In fact, we can even connect this trace to an extrude, like so. And it's really, really long at first, but you can see that we now have this really long 3D banana, which has been converted from this movie file in. And if we actually play with an effect on the way, so let me change this input. So I'm going to click to open a different input and we get this starfish. So I've changed the very source image and it's changed all of the effects along the way. And now we have this 3D little starfish going on. Isn't that cool? Isn't that cool? And then yeah, we can literally take this 2D object, we could render this out into a geometry with lighting, and then we can add in materials to make it all sparkly and reflective. We won't go too much into that today, but it's already starting to show you the power of Touchdesigner, of how we can interact with those different mediums together so easily. So that's sort of how you connect different operators from one another. But there's another way of doing this per se, which is if I go ahead and get my noise from my noise chop, we can essentially assign the value of this. So actually, let me make this a constant. So a constant is just going to be a number, a constant of sorts, and we can drag the slider up and down between 0 and 1. You can also hold middle mouse button and then hover over these little effects here, and then when I hover over say 10 and start going to the right, it starts increasing in increments of 10. So if I set that to 21, we can set this operator here to control one of these operators. So let's say we want to have it control the noise, and I want it to control the strength. What I do is I click the plus to interact with this number, and then while I've clicked on the edge here, I drag from the interactive constant and drop it onto the slider that I want. So in this case, the strength. And then I'm just going to click chop reference. So I'm referencing the chop. And now you can see that when I drag this chop slider down or back up again, it's controlling the other operator, so the different sort of operator. So this is one way we can translate information to an effect or a different class of operators. You can already probably start to imagine, like, if we inputted audio into the software and then analyze that audio in real time, we could set that parameter to control an effect, and it's quite simple and easy to do so. And again, this all trails on. So if I drag the strength all the way up, we get that weird little box going around the outside, and maybe I don't like that, so let's drag it all the way down to like there, where we get that smooth little shape, which is all because we've been feeding it on for a root like that. Now actually I don't even think an edge is needed in this case, because we're not really using the edge per se, but that pretty much gets the point across. So far we've gone across the different types of nodes and what nodes are in Touchdesigner. Now, we're not going to get too specific into anything like 3D rendering or effects. You can already see there's quite a few different paths for us to go down. I recommend at this point, if you want, to maybe just start with the purple operators. That Jelly Bean project, you can probably see a lot of these effects in place already. And then you could say, right click here and insert operator and be like, what does a displace do? Let's try that. Oh, it needs another input. Let me create another movie file in and drag that. Oh, what's happened there? I have no idea. Let me change some of these values around and be like, oh, something cool's happening. Now you can click on help to learn about what a displace is, and that will take you to the wiki. Highly recommend Googling, just trying to figure it out. There's really cool effects with individual nodes in Touchdesigner, but with where you're at, highly recommend just playing around and being like, oh cool, I made this little thing. And then as soon as you get an effect you like you're like, oh wow, that's cool, try control it with another element like this. Another cool thing is an LFO. So an LFO is just going to pulse between two values like so. So if we set this to control our displace weight, so when I drag it onto the name, it'll do all the parameters next to it and reference it, you can see we're getting this crazy little effect going on, which is going all the way down to our 3D object right here. So play around with it like that. Before you do that, we're gonna also talk about the palette really quick, and then I'm gonna talk about how you record or export this out through, say, a projector, which is, I think, a very highly requested thing. So if you have your own videos or information that you've played around with or made in other software, say you've made like a 3D object, you can drag and drop that 3D object into here, render it out if you want, or just leave it as is, and then I'll teach you how to add some cool effects like these, or just project it. But first, let's talk about the palette. So in the top left, we click this little button called palette. Palette is basically a bunch of pre-made tools that do some really cool things. So we have generators, like generating some noise like this. It's a little bit different to this kind of noise, and I'll explain why soon. We have image filters, a bunch of cool filters, mapping tools like for projection mapping, which is really cool. Oculus Rift support, point cloud generation, Ableton integration if you make music, which is really sick. Definitely look into that if you use Ableton, and a whole bunch more. Tools is also a really important shout out here. And custom components. I haven't imported mine, I'm so lazy. I always just redrag them in. But essentially, these palettes are a bunch of pre-made node networks packaged as one little tool. What I mean by that is you saw at the start of the video when I accidentally zoomed out, this is our whole project file, and we click into it, these are our nodes. This is essentially that. So when we click into this, there's a bunch of pre-made networks already made. Now, don't usually recommend going inside and changing these, but instead just clicking on them and using the pre-made sort of cool tools up here to be like, oh wow, I've got some cool little noise going on. Another really useful section is the image filters. So these are really, really cool effects. If I drag the bloom onto here and we drag our starfish into the input of the bloom, you can see we get a really cool looking starfish, and if we just randomly play around with some of the effects, you can make it glow in a really cool way, and it's like, wow, look at that, let's crank that up, oh my god, that's crazy. Like a bunch of really cool pre-made tools that do really cool stuff. Tools is also super useful. There's pre-made like audio analysis tools like this, there's equalizers, SVG tools, like there's just so much here. Highly recommend just playing around with a lot of these, dragging and dropping them into your project, being like, what are the inputs? Oh cool, let me drag my starfish into there, my other starfish into there, and then connect an output. So I'm just doing a null, I set this to my background and go, okay, what are our options here? Oh, crossfade, what does VJing do? Oh, whoa, that's cool. I haven't even used this tool before, and that's really cool. Another thing that's worth note is a lot of these have interactive UIs. So by that I mean when we click the plus icon like so, you can be like, use the UIs from these menus and then sort of interact with it in a cool sort of way. Oh, subtracting, that looks cool. Stuff like that. That's the palette. So lastly, I want to touch on recording and projecting, and while this is a long tutorial, sorry, I hope this is useful. Let me know if, before I get into the final stuff, please give me feedback. Everyone's way too nice that does give feedback. Give me some critical feedback. Did I talk too long? Did I put too much into the one tutorial? Was it just right? This is probably a pretty boring video, but nevertheless, if you manage to make it through, I would gladly appreciate that feedback. But let's just quickly press on. So let's say we want to record this out. There is a movie file out option. So we click like that. We can set the type to movie, image, or image sequence. You have codecs here. On the free version, you won't have access to this one, but this one's typically the recommended codec for YouTube and Resolume and stuff. But let's just say I use this. I like to turn unique suffix on, and I'll just keep the file name as is. I have no audio to drag in just yet. Set the FPS, blah blah blah, and then you just hit record, and you can see that this is active now and it's recording. And if I actually play around with these effects, this will be recorded as a video, and then I stop recording like that. That will give us a cool little nifty video. Now if you want to project it, you go to the comp and get a window instead. A window, and then you drag your output, so your final little operator here, this is the one I'm like, cool, I want to project this, and you drag and drop it onto windows like this. If you want to use multiple projectors, it's as easy as doing that, and then you can set different outputs to different things. Within this window, there's little commands, little options you'll need to configure. So obviously your projector will just be acting as a second monitor to your PC, so you need to specify which one that is. So this is probably your default monitor, 1 or 2. I also recommend turning borders off and always on top, so it always appears on top. And then you just click this little button here, open as a separate window, and it will open this little operator in a full screen window set to all the DPIs that you have set here. Mine are just default right now because I have no projector plugged in. But yes, that's pretty much it. Sorry, this tutorial was such a mouthful, and I made this because I'm procrastinating other Touchdesigner work. But if you enjoyed today's tutorial, please let me know. I would be keen to make a lot more concise ones in the future, but I hope this has acted as a little explanation of how stuff works. If you would want me to do a tutorial on making your first visual or making your first projection, whatever it may be, please let me know. But I hope this is at least enough for you to get started. Drag your projects in, send me what you make, give me feedback, hit that subscribe button. If you're able to support me on Patreon, that's greatly appreciated. Otherwise, do not stress, and have a beautiful day. Bye.